None of us has escaped misshapen understandings of Jesus and of faith. It's one of the byproducts of living in a fallen world. Now, sometimes we misunderstand. Sometimes our finite minds and our unhealed souls, they pass on unhealth. Sometimes we don't get it right. What Jesus is addressing here is not imperfection. It's not just making mistakes. What Jesus is addressing is those in power who are abusing their power. We need to notice, friends, we need to notice how Jesus engaged with people differently. His most compassionate, his most grace-filled, his most forgiving words were often directed to those most marginalized, most vulnerable, most downtrodden. And his harshest words were often directed at those with privilege and power, those who should have known better, those who had the opportunity and the ability and the calling as the spiritual and religious leaders, those who had influence in political and economic matters, and yet who failed to recognize that the standard they would be measured against was not how well they were doing, but how well they were taking care of the least of these. It's hard to separate our experiences of and at the hands of those claiming to represent God from our experiences of God. Right? It's hard to separate our experiences of and our experiences at the hands of those who claim to represent God from our experiences of God. In the words of Carol Howard Merritt from her book, Healing Spiritual Wounds, she says, the reason religious wounds can cut so deeply is that they carry the weight of God with them. In some way, we have felt that God was behind what wounded us. And so the first step in spiritual healing is to learn to love God by separating God from our experience of being wounded. In this fallen world, all of us have things we're healing from. All of us are hopefully on a journey to try to see God as truly as God is, at least as much as we can this side of Christ's return. And not just through someone else's broken lens or someone else's limited worldview. This is one of the reasons we're looking at Mark's gospel. It's one of the reasons that every few years we go through a gospel as a church, because we heal when we look to Jesus. We heal when we look to Jesus, because when we look to Jesus, we see who God is, who God really is, what God is like, what God looks like, what God says, what God does. We need to be reminded that God did not condone what the pastor of your last church did. That God is not like the youth leader who failed to report your abusive situation or even perpetrated it. God actively opposes the self-proclaimed Christian politicians who tweet Bible verses while legislating against the very people God defends, the poor, the immigrant, the vulnerable. You know, I take so much comfort from what I learned from Jesus here in this parable, who God stands with and who God stands against. Jesus stands against economic exploitation. Jesus stands against religious exclusion. Jesus stands against spiritual abuse. And by implication, Jesus stands with those who have been made poor, and those who have been labeled sinners, and those who have been hurt and harmed by people in positions of spiritual and religious authority, whether directly or indirectly. Jesus stands with you. God is with you. That statement is not just a descriptor of geographical presence. That is a statement of who God is for.